to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
So Dave, here we are, Liddypod 5. I can't believe that, anyone other than our friends are still listening to this, but there we go.
And in spite of public opinion and protest, we are still here.
We are still here. We are underground now, but we are still broadcasting. We're on Liddypod 5, and it's good to have you here. Thanks very much for tuning in. Now, Dave, you're known, amongst other things, as being a great author, and your latest book is Finding the Fourth Beatle. And this is interesting because, you know, everybody talks about who was the fifth Beatle.
Yeah.
And we go through, you know, Brian Epstein, Stuart Sutcliffe, all sorts of people. So Finding the Fourth Beatle. Yeah. Tell us what the book is all about for those people who have not read it. Okay,
so Finding the Fourth Beatle. This wasn't the first title we had. From the beginning of it, my second book was The Fab 104, The Evolution of the Beatles. And I was detailing all the different musicians, etc., involved in getting to the point at the end of 62 of the Fab Four. Now, my friend Garry Popper said to me, "You've highlighted something which nobody else has, is that up to that point, the Beatles from the Quarrymen through to 62 had 12 drummers." He said, "We should do a book on the drummers." I said, "Great." So we said, we're going to call it 12 Drummers Drumming.
Now, that would have been a brilliant title.
It would have been a good title, until I found number 13.
I can imagine the excitement of finding the 13th one, but then the disappointment that you've lost your title.
Yeah, the stick I had from Garry over the 3 years we were writing this together, is I kept finding it more. He said, "Will you stop digging up more drummers?" I said, "I'm sorry, but just keep finding them." So we ended up with 23 drummers between 1956 and when the Beatles break up in 1970, and we were going through different book titles, and then Garry said something important to me, and he said, "Beatles should be in the title, but we've got this great quote from Neil Aspinall, who says the story of the Beatles was always John, Paul, George and a drummer, so they're the Fab Three. This should be the fourth Beatle." And then we started digging into Beatles history and realising that so the major crisis points they have all seem to revolve around a different drummer. So why, in the end, was Ringo the drummer who made it? So it's like it's the ultimate search for that permanent fourth Beatle, the one who was the right one, who stayed with them through the career. So it's looking at all the different drummers who played, and that search by the Fab Three for the fourth Beatle. So that's why he's the fourth one, and we'll have the fifth Beatle discussion another time.
But I think this is a fascinating part of the story, the drummer. So we haven't got time to go through all 23 of the drummers, but we are going to briefly run through as many of them as we can. Take us right back to the start, Dave.
So obviously the first drummer is Colin Hanson. So he drummed with the Quarrymen. And he's just brought out a great new book, which we'll feature in a later episode as well. His recollections from being there end of 56 when the Quarrymen are getting themselves together. And he was there until early 59. So he's the first drummer. And really, if you're looking at the solid blocks, then it was Colin for a couple of years. The next permanent one was Pete Best from 60 to 62. And then you got Ringo from 62 through till 70. So they're like your three main drummers. But in between and in the middle of various ones of these, you've got the occasional drummer who sat in maybe for one night. One of them played for one song only. Now the criteria, we had to put down what is the criteria, and they must have played with the group as either part of the group, at a gig or on a recording as a drummer. And we stuck to drumming. We could have gone down the percussion link, but then the numbers would just be ridiculous.
Yeah, sure.
You start dragging in Mal Evans for clunking the anvil and hammer on Maxwell Silver hammer. So we thought, no, we're going to stick to proper drummers. So that's sort of the criteria. So we start with Colin, and funnily enough, when the book had been sent off to the printer, it's one of those, not quite hold the front page, but hold page 43 or whatever it was. We sent it off as 22, and I found the 23rd. And again, I can blame Colin Hanton for this, because Colin revealed in his book that on one night at the end of 57, they were playing a wedding reception, and this was the night that Pete Shotton quit. This is when John smashed the washboard over Pete's head at the end of the night. Well, Colin had gone to the pub, I think with a girlfriend, and didn't come back for the second half. So Pete Shotton actually sat in. No, he wasn't a drummer. He wasn't a washboard player either, as such, but he was there, he was John's mate. So Pete Shotton, right at the beginning of the career, became drummer 23. So there's occasional things like that. Now, some of the drummers that they're well known, when you get into 1960, that's the year when there's so much change, because that's when they first get together as a group, and they go to Alan Williams and they ask him to be their manager. And of course, the first thing they need is a drummer. So Alan manages to get them Tommy Moore. So his first appearance with them is the audition with Larry Parnes on the 10th of May 1960, and Tommy turns up late. So Johnny Hutch, they were casting the Casanovas then, he sat in until Tommy turned up, and there's that great photo of John, Paul, George and Stuart really getting into it, and Johnny Hutch on the drums at the back looking so bored. he is not happy being there. And he still talks about it now. He says they were crap. So Johnny had to sit here until Tommy Moore arrived. Now Tommy Moore's an interesting character. He was only with the group from that May 60, and then sometime early middle of June 60. So he's only in for about 6 weeks. But he was their first proper drummer. But there's never been that much information about Tommy. Now this is where, with my Beatles detective hat on, I go digging and digging, and I end up finding a friend of Tommy's who played with him in a jazz group. Other people knew Tommy well, but then I was fortunate enough to find Tommy's wife Rita. Lovely conversation with her. Got some great photos. Talked to their daughters as well, and so for the first time we've got a full biography of Tommy, because there's various stories being invented about him, things being written by so many people that's speculating, but now we can say here is a full proper biography of Tommy. So I was really excited to find that. Then after Tommy quit, Norman Chapman becomes the drummer, and for the Fab 104 book that I did, I'd found Norman's daughter, so the only ever published photos of Norman Chapman are in that book. So again, we've got a nice biography of Norman, and he was the guy who, just before the Beatles are going to Hamburg, got the invitation from Her Majesty to go and do national service. So poor Norman, and Norman was a great drummer. The Beatles really liked him as well. So that created the vacancy that Pete Best then fills at short notice. But in the middle of all that happening, when Tommy quits, they do the famous Grosvenor Ballroom and the legend of Ronnie the Ted. Now, Ronnie the Ted, he has so far been this mythical guy. We know at some point during the evening, they got a drum kit set up but no drummer, and John makes some kind of joke to the waiting crowd. You know, is there a drummer in the house? Whatever he says. And this big guy, Ronnie, leader of a Teddy Boy gang, gets up, and they were scared stiff of him. So he spends the night bashing away at the drums, and at the end of the night, he says, "Can I join you?" And of course, the Beatles are wimps. They're not really tough. And little Alan Williams, bless him, he said, "Oh, it's great, thanks very much. If we haven't got a drummer by next week, we'll give you a call." And he got them out of it. Finally, after years of searching, we found out who Ronnie the Ted was.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. I'm so delighted. It's such a small incident, but I've been searching for Ronnie the Ted. So Ronnie Houlihan, and he was a gang leader over in Wallasey. Died many years ago, unfortunately. But we know who Ronnie the Ted was. Yeah. But funny enough, on that same night, a 16-year-old lad thought he'd help, and he got up there and sat in, and he played for one song, and he said, "I was so terrible, I walked off again." Funnily enough, that 16-year-old lad never became a drummer, but he became a guitarist.
Oh, tell us more.
And a lead singer. And he recorded at Apple.
Okay, go. You're going to have to reveal this one to us, Dave.
Jackie Lomax.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Jackie Lomax from The Undertakers.
Yeah.
And of course, he signed with Apple, did Sour Milk Sea. George Harrison worked with him. Great singer, great frontman. But yeah, when he was 16, he played one song with the Silver Beatles that night.
Incredible. That is incredible.
So some great little stories like that, which are fun.
Yeah.
So just getting through that mad bit of 1960. I think it's about 8 different drummers.
Yeah.
Just in 1960.
Yeah. Just before we come on to the critical period with Pete and Ringo, why do you think it was that the issue was always a drummer?
A good drummer is hard to find. Having played with a number of drummers over the years, you know very, very quickly in a group if the drummer works or doesn't. If the chemistry isn't right, if the playing isn't right, the band doesn't work. You know, the first band I was in, and our drummer was a mate of mine from school. He qualified because he was a mate of mine from school with the drum kit. He couldn't keep time, which apparently is quite important in a band. Yeah, so you'd start off a song slowly, and by the end of it, you're galloping. So if the drummer is wrong, the whole band falls apart. So if that doesn't work, it's no good. Now with Tommy Moore, for example, Tommy was a very, very good drummer. Jazz drummer, he could play just about anything. He was a bit older than the others. And as seemed to be a popular theme through the story of the Beatles, didn't get on with John. Yeah, this crops up a few times, doesn't it? Particularly when they did that little tour around Scotland. And they were away for 2 weeks, and Johnny Gentle was driving the van, crashed the van. The guitar cases came flying forward, smashed into Tommy's face, split lip, lost teeth, into hospital. But of course they were playing that night, so he's in hospital, his lips swollen, blood everywhere, he's got concussion. So if you offer the chance with concussion, what instrument do you not want to play? It's the drums, isn't it? You don't want to be playing drums. And John dragged Tommy out of his hospital bed and stuck him behind the drum kit. And apparently, in rock and roll music, I got no kick against modern jazz. Apparently at that point, they would all turn around and look at Tommy, because he was a jazz drummer. And then John would try to make Tommy laugh, because if he laughed, his stitches might burst. I don't see what his problem was, really.
So, Dave, who would you say, obviously Pete Best is the obvious one, but who would you say, out of that whole stream of drummers, that came closest to becoming the permanent drummer?
Very good question. It all comes down to, and it's a funny thing with Beatle history, but as I found when I was digging into the Fab 104, all these musicians that came and went, it seemed to be the right person was always there at the right time. So a lot of people, first of all, they take the mickey out of Ringo, and we'll deal with that in a moment, because that is exceedingly unfair. Or they take the mickey out of Pete, which again is unfair. The way I see it, there are 3 bands we're looking at. You've got the Quarrymen, who were the skiffle group, who were having fun. Colin was great for that, but he was not a rock and roll drummer. You've then got the rock and roll band, who really begin to be a brilliant rock and roll band in Hamburg in August 1960. So for those 2 years, Pete Best was a great drummer. But, and I make this point in one of the chapters in the book, at that point I say the Beatles are dead, long live the Fab Four. As Pete leaves, that's the end of the rock and roll Beatles band, and a new pop group called the Fab Four with Ringo Starr is born. They're a recording group. They're very, very different to the rock and roll covers band they had been the last 2 years. And so Pete was the right drummer back then, and too many people criticised him. And then a lot of people criticised Ringo as well. And we thought, how are we going to deal with this? Because some people are so invested in one or the other, they won't listen to any other arguments. So firstly I thought, well, let's explain the Beatles are dead longer than the Fab Four. Look at them as two separate bands. But, and this is a problem, because just about every other Beatles book has been written by a non-drummer. Now, as we have discussed in the past, you and I, our drumming is limited to a side drum in the Voice Brigade.
That's correct, yeah.
So I can play a side drum, I can't play a drum kit. So what we decided to do was, let's make this objective and get drummers commenting on particularly Pete and Ringo. So in total we used, I think it was 9 different drummers of different experiences and got them to assess Pete and Ringo.
You're listening to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
So today, Dave, we are talking about, the contents of your book, Finding the Fourth Beatle, looking at the drummers. And as you just said, the way you approached it was to not just look historically at what happened, but look at it also from the point of view of drummers and their view on the drummers of the group that was to become the Beatles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it's the only way to deal with this ongoing argument of whether Pete was rubbish and Ringo was great, or Pete was great, Ringo was rubbish, or they were both rubbish, whichever you wanted, and thought the only way to do this was to use these different drummers. So the good thing is, when we look at Pete Best with the Beatles, we've got the recordings of My Bonnie that they did in June '61 out in Hamburg. We've got the whole of the Decca audition. We've got recordings of their BBC performances in March and June '62, and we've got the EMI audition in June '62. So for that purpose, I got 3 drummers, completely different ages, experiences. We've got one guy, Mike Rice, who was in a Liverpool band in the '60s. So as well as playing drums in a band called the Senators, he saw both Pete and Ringo, likes them both, hadn't listened to these recordings. Another guy called Derek Hinton, who's in his early 50s. He's an all-round musician. Again, he'd never listened to these. And then his son, who was completing his music degree, not a particular fan of the Beatles, and had certainly never listened to the early stuff. And all I did was I played them these songs and said, as a drummer, give me your feedback. And of course, as drummers, they're picking up stuff which me would never have picked up on. And so we've got that nice, independent, objective feedback. And so for Pete, the feedback, particularly when you look at the Decca audition, and in some books, Pete's blamed for failing, and I think we'll probably do an episode of Liddypod just on the Decca audition. It's such a big thing. Pete comes out of it really well. I mean, the drumming on My Bonnie, I mean, you can just listen to that, and the speed of the fills that Pete does are just phenomenal. So Pete, great drummer for what they were doing. But then when it came to Ringo, again, I don't know whether just because he was always the joker, he was the clown, people never really taken him seriously. And I have to admit, I'd never listened to the Beatles songs for the drumming. So I always say to people, go and listen to the Beatles songs to listen to the drumming. And we mentioned this in the previous episode. No, Ringo was a great innovative drummer. He changed how things were doing, how you drummed, your contribution to the song as well. So that was our way of looking at how do we separate these drummers out and how do we analyse them. So this way, it's not just, well, David Bedford says this, another author says this. We're not putting it down as authors, we're saying this is what drummers actually say about the Beatles drummers.
That's a fascinating approach to it. And Dave, what did they say? What was the outcome?
The main outcome was that Peter, it's like I was saying before, if you're in a band and a drummer doesn't work, you know very, very quickly. Pete Best was in the Beatles for 2 years. If your drummer's no good, you don't last 2 years. I mean, somebody calculated it, I think playing live, Pete played more hours live with the Beatles than Ringo did. All those hundreds of hours, particularly in Hamburg, where they honed their craft. You know, Pete was the drummer with the band when they got Brian as the manager. When they got the recording contract, even though they decided to get rid of Pete, he was their drummer at the time. So you can't just say, oh, we got rid of Pete because he was a crap drummer, because that doesn't fit. But the only way of looking at that was to get these other drummers in and give us their feedback. And Pete comes across as a really good drummer. The lovely bit was when we start looking at, well, this is the chase for the fourth Beatle. We're trying to find who this permanent guy is. Was asking these other drummers, particularly drummers from Beatles tribute bands, who have to learn to play the Ringo parts, and they tell us how hard it is. And I learned so much listening to the drummers. So it's more than just Garry and I telling the stories. We're trying to put everything into context and to analyse the drummers too.
This is Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
Now listen, we try to do, Dave, as part of our Liddypod episodes, a little bit of analysis. And as I was saying in the last episode of Liddypod, when we were looking at Sir George Martin, I've given you this title of the Beatles detective, and I love the way that you're able to forensically analyse certain situations. And one of the biggest parts of that story is about that sort of switchover between Pete and Ringo. And you know, one of the questions that fascinated me when we were talking at off air was a question about why Pete wasn't sacked in the August of 1962. Give us your Beatles detective analysis of that, Dave.
This is probably the story that's fascinated, you know, most Beatles fans. It's this mystery since 1962, and ever since I started on this journey to research and write about the Beatles, particularly looking at the early years, was why did they sack Pete Best? And there's been so many reasons given, and depending on which book you pick up, they'll give you a different reason. And some of them are myths, some of them are partially true. I think, why did they sack him? Now we come back to Beatles Detective in the last episode, which was, were the Beatles under contract in June 62 or not? And we established that that was an audition. That becomes important to what happens to Pete. Because when you go back to what George Martin said to Brian Epstein, the big word is if. And George said, if we're going to make a record, I'm going to bring in a session drummer. Now Brian, who knows nothing about protocol in studios, he goes to John, Paul and George and says, okay, George Martin likes what we've done, but there's a problem. He doesn't think Pete's good enough to drum on the first record. Now that's not actually what George Martin said. And I went back and analysed, okay, what was the usual thing that happened in studios back then? Use of session musicians was huge. It was standard practice, particularly for a new band, because drumming was hard to record.
So just before we go back to the specifics of this, Dave, why was it so usual to bring session drummers in?
What you got with a session drummer, and this happens to Ringo, of course, because their first session in 4th of September with Ringo, George Martin doesn't like Ringo's drumming and brings in Andy White as session drummer. Okay,
we'll come back to that in a moment. Yeah. But just tell me why they would bring session drummers in.
Well, what Andy White brought and what any of these session drummers bring is they would come into the studio, listen to the song, learn their part, and you could do 100 takes and it'd be exactly the same. They knew the dynamics of the studio, the setup of the drums, and they could learn the part and they could play it exactly as the producer wanted it. Playing live with a band and playing drums in a studio are very, very different. And the inexperience of firstly Pete and then with Ringo in a studio shows up because they couldn't get what the producer wanted. A session drummer would be cheap. Andy White was paid like about £5 or something. His fee, walk in, does a few songs in the morning, goes off to another studio, does other songs. They were reliable, they were cheap, they were effective, so he could get on with the rest, recording the rest of the group. So George Martin was thinking, okay, first record, we'll do something. I'll just bring a session drummer in, we'll get it done nice and quickly and cheaply. Brian doesn't know that. So he says to John, Paul and George, George Martin doesn't think Pete's good enough. When you start then digging into what particularly John, Paul and George said at that point, and Paul in particular says, we were thinking, we can't get rid of him, can we? He worked great live. We've been playing for 2 years together. But if the producer doesn't think he's good enough, we're going to have to get rid of him. Because that's what they thought they had to do.
So really, the what resulted in Pete being removed from the band really came about because of a misunderstanding between what George Martin had said and what Brian Epstein had understood.
Exactly. Now, lots of people like to go back further and sort of recreate, well, they never liked Pete. Pete was never good enough. Well, with the Beatles detective hat on, I go for evidence. What does the evidence show? And at no point before then had they raised concerns that we know evidentially. Now, there may be some bits of hearsay for when the Beatles were famous years later looking back, but there's no evidence to say Pete's job was at risk at any point. That is the catalyst for what happens next. They make the decision. Now, a lot of the myths that build up, they say, oh, he wouldn't get his hair cut the same. He didn't socialise with him. He was too quiet. They're all sort of secondary things. Possibly when they get together and think, well, can we do this? Well, I tell you what, Brian, it would get Mona Best out of your hair, wouldn't it? Or he doesn't always come out for a drink with us, does he? And their bits, they justify it to themselves. But yeah, what George Martin said to Brian, what Brian said to the other three, that's what starts the whole process.
And there's two things which are important here. As you said a few moments ago, Pete was the drummer for 2 years.
Yep.
And you would have found out in that 2 year period that this person was not good enough. And also, we were talking in the last episode of Liddypod about the contract, and we said that it had been sent to Brian Epstein before the 6th of June non-audition or audition. We know it was an audition now at EMI. It was then subsequently signed on the 18th of June and returned at the end of July to Brian Epstein, but it wasn't signed or returned on the proviso that they replaced their drummer.
Exactly.
It was purely a decision of George Martin that would have been fairly normal at the time to say, just to warn you, Mr. Epstein, I am going to bring in a session drummer. The way Brian heard that was, Pete is not good enough.
Yep.
We should be worried about this.
Yeah, exactly. So because of all that, there'd been no attempts to get rid of Pete before this point. They took no action until the contract arrived. In the meantime, they started saying, okay, we're going to have to make this change. What do we do? And of course, John, Paul and George say to Brian, you're the manager, it's your job. So Brian then gets in touch with his lawyer and says, what do I do? And he gets advice from the lawyer. That culminates in the meeting when Brian calls Pete into the office to give him the news.
And that was the 16th of August 1962.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in between then, other drummers that are starting to be asked. Pete knows none of this. So I thought, how can we look at this again? How do we find out what really happened? Fortunately, Brian's lawyer, who gave him that advice all the way through, still lives in Liverpool.
Convenient.
Nice and convenient. Just up the road from me. And I went to see him and had an amazing interview. And at one point, what he said left me speechless. Now, as you know, anybody who knows me, it takes a lot to make me speechless.
So come on, Dave, reveal all.
So David Roberts was Brian's lawyer. And he said to me, first thing I said to Brian was, you can't sack him. He said, so I can assure you that Pete Best was never sacked. From 1962, we've been told Pete was sacked. He said, he couldn't be sacked. He certainly couldn't be sacked by Brian.
Why? Why couldn't it be sacked by Brian?
Because we've been looking at this the wrong way round. Brian was the agent and manager employed by the Beatles to find work for them.
Okay.
They employed him. Brian didn't employ the Beatles.
Okay.
So Brian's got no authority to sack anybody.
Okay, that's cleared that one. That's good. Okay.
Secondly, what do you need if you're going to be sacked, your status of employment has to be employed by somebody. Who employed the Beatles? Nobody. In the eyes of the law, they're a legal partnership. To help this, I then found, it was actually the partner in the law firm David Roberts worked in at the time. He actually drew up a partnership agreement between John, Paul, George and Pete.
When was this tape?
Around December 1961.
Okay.
So Pete Best, the drummer they're supposedly wanting to get rid of. So why did they sign a partnership agreement at the end of 1961 with him?
And why did they sign a partnership agreement anyway? And who advised them to do that?
That would have been in discussions with Brian's lawyer, David Roberts, because they said, well, can you help us? And he said, no, hang on a sec, you have to understand. I represent Brian. Because he drew up the management contract with the Beatles. He said, I can't represent you. You need to find your own representation. So they spoke to the partner in the same firm. And he drew up the partnership agreement.
So this was subsequent to Brian seeing them at the Cavern,
Yeah.
9th of November 61, subsequent meeting they had with Brian, and that was at the point when they were given advice that they needed some sort of legal agreement to help them going forward in their negotiation with whoever
Exactly.
would become their manager.
Yeah. So no other band in Liverpool had done this. So this became like the template, but when I interviewed Eric, who was the partner who drew it up, he's in his 90s, sharp as a button, brilliant. He remembers everything. He said, I just got a template partnership agreement, made a couple of amendments to it to put their names in, etc. Signed it, and that was it. It was done. So because the Beatles were a legal partnership, and even if they hadn't have done that, by the way, even if they didn't have the partnership agreement, they were still a legal partnership.
In the eyes of the law.
In the eyes of the law.
Yeah.
So you cannot sack a partner. And this was the big problem that the Beatles faced. To properly, legally get rid of Pete, they would have had to dissolve the partnership.
Okay.
So that means drawing up the paperwork, officially dissolving the Beatles as a partnership, drawing up accounts, settling accounts, and then starting up again. They didn't have the time to do that.
This didn't happen.
This didn't happen.
Okay. So what did happen?
What they had to do was, and it's very Machiavellian, this, it really is, they had to convince Pete that he was being sacked without telling him he was sacked. So then you go back to recollections from Brian and Pete for that meeting, and it all fits. Because, and this is why Brian was so nervous, he had to get this right. Brian said to Pete, I don't know how to tell you this, but the boys want you out, i.e. your partners want to get rid of you. Mm-hmm. And Ringo's joining on Saturday. Now, as a 21-year-old, what does that tell you? Oh, I've been sacked.
Yeah.
Brian never told me he was sacked. He's told him his partners want rid of him and he's being replaced by Ringo. Now, at that point, if Pete had been savvy and up to date with the law, he could have said, that's very interesting, Brian. I'm going to go and speak to my lawyer. That would have been messy. And that's a court case that could have dragged on just when they didn't need it. So they had to convince Pete he was being sacked, which worked. But then legally, Brian, as manager for Pete, has to provide work for him. So Brian offers him the drumming role in the Mersey Beats. But they were just starting up. Pete was never going to accept that. Brian speaks to his friend Joe Flannery, who's putting together Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. Joe Flannery rings Pete and says, sorry to hear what's happened. Do you want to come and join my new supergroup? And Pete says yes. Effectively, Pete quits the Beatles.
So that's really interesting. This not effectively, but legally, we're saying that Pete was never sacked.
Never sacked.
He couldn't have been sacked anyway,
No.
because it was a legal partnership. They would have had to dissolve the partnership and reformulate it with this new drummer, Ringo Starr. But by accepting this position in another band, effectively, Pete walked away from the partnership.
Yeah. In legal terms, that's what happened. So really, all these years, we thought that Pete was sacked. And he was convinced he was sacked. He wasn't. And it's because we looked at it the wrong way. And it's only with that meeting with Brian's lawyer, David Roberts, once he explained everything, it all made sense. He said Pete then did go and get legal advice, but bad legal advice, because his solicitor tried to sue Brian for wrongful dismissal. So David Roberts said that was nice and easy. Sent a reply, my client didn't employ your client. And this still bounced backwards and forwards for years.
Yeah. Do you think, Dave, I mean, we live, and our cousins from the other side of the Atlantic who are listening to Liddypod maybe don't understand the way the British legal system works, but it's clear to say that we live today in much more litigious times than they would have done in the early 60s. And perhaps today, had that situation arisen, and let's not forget, we're looking at the Beatles historically here. So in the August of 1962, yes, they had their recording contract, but they hadn't even recorded a proper record at that point, other than what they'd done in Hamburg. So it was still the very, very beginning of things. But if that was today, or if today's litigious nature was imposed upon that August 62 time, perhaps Pete would have taken a different approach. Perhaps he would have been given different advice. Funnily
enough, it has happened on a number of occasions. Probably the most high-profile one was with the Eagles. And they'd had their health freezes over. They got back together after all these years, and they were touring again. And at that stage, because the Eagles were particularly about Glenn Fry and Don Henley, they drew up a new contract, and Don and Glenn would get a larger cut than the rest of them. Don Felder, the guitarist for the Eagles, wasn't happy with that. And so, because he wouldn't agree to it, Don and Glenn, the Eagles, said to their manager, Irving Azoff, go and sack him. Sounds familiar. So Irving goes and takes Don Felder out to lunch and says, this is what's happened, you won't agree to it, so you're out the band. But Don Felder was a member of the partnership called the Eagles. And I think it was about 6 years before they eventually came to an out-of-court settlement. Now what that meant was Don Felder no longer played with the group, but because he was a partner in the Eagles and he got good legal advice, he could then challenge everything, and it took him years and years to resolve it. So that's just one of the examples. There are a number of examples there where they tried to do the same thing, and it's got big, big repercussions. So, as you rightly said, we're at the start of the Beatles' career. They hadn't really done much. So financially, it wouldn't have been a massive thing. But the principle still exists today.
Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating for a part of the Beatles story, which clearly has been so misunderstood, misconstrued over the years, how Pete was removed from the band, voluntarily walked away from the band, whichever way you put it, but clearly it was not a sacking.
Subscribe at liddypod.com and you'll never miss another episode.
So Dave, that's absolutely fascinating, but there is one thing that still confuses me. When EMI had their group, they had this group called the Beatles, presumably with 4 signatures on the contract. But one of those was no longer valid. Was that right? Were they the people that signed the contract with EMI?
No. John, Paul, George and Pete had signed a management contract with Brian. But the contract with Parlophone EMI was between them and Brian Epstein, who by contract had to provide a group called the Beatles.
Right.
So it doesn't name the individuals in there. But it does bring up an interesting point, which again has baffled us for years. I wasn't particularly helped by George Martin, because to be fair to him, when he was interviewed, he could remember important information about the recording career and stuff, but he often sort of conflated the 2 first recording sessions in September. So we think, well, what was his reaction to John, Paul, George and Ringo walking through the door? And one of the interviews he gave was, he said, they walk in with this other drummer who I knew nothing about. Said, but of course, I had my own session drummer in there. Now that is 4th of September and the 11th of September. he got confused quite often. So look, what was the status of the 4th of September? Was that a full recording session? Again, it's a stage on from an audition because they've already got the contract. But that was to see where they were up to. Because George Martin had told them to go and work on Love Me Do and of course the other songs. He'd already sent them How Do You Do It, the song he wanted them to record, which they'd done a version of. So he was having a run through. But as far as he was concerned, he didn't know they changed their drummer. But then, again, we refer back to Tune In, to Mark Lewison's book. And he had solved this. And he said Brian Epstein had phoned Judy Lockhart-Smith, George's, at the time, secretary, then became his wife, and informed him of the change of drummer. But there was no footnote to it. And a friend of mine actually asked him, he said, I'm glad you've sorted this out. How did you find it out? And he said, well, I didn't, but it's safe to presume it happened. Which basically, he's guessing because that's how it would explain why Ringo was there and there wasn't a big kickoff. So it's a speculation that there's no actual evidence that George Martin knew. And in fact, I actually asked Lady Judy Martin, as she is now, I said to her, do you remember this conversation? She said no.
Yeah. Which you probably wouldn't, would you, really?
No.
It was a minor detail, wasn't it?
Yeah, but she remembered other conversations she had with Brian, but she had no recollection of being informed that there'd been a change of drummer.
Okay.
And George Martin had never mentioned it. So Ringo turns up with the other three, and George Martin's surprised. But it doesn't invalidate the contract, which the initial question is, did they do anything wrong? And I'd say probably ethically, I think Brian should have informed George Martin that they made a material change to the group he thought he was signing.
Yes, yeah.
But there's no proof that he ever did.
Yeah.
But it didn't invalidate the contract.
So let's get this right. We already know, because this was the thing that led towards Pete being removed from the band, that George Martin had said that he was going to use a session drummer, and we've been through the reasons why that happened. So we get to that point in early September when the Beatles arrive at Abbey Road for their recording session. Just take us through that timeline of Andy White and his input into those recording sessions.
Okay, so there's been some confusion as to who Andy White was there to replace. What we know, because I interviewed Andy, and hopefully again in a future episode we'll replay some of that interview.
Yeah, that'd be good.
He's a fascinating guy, Andy. The Beatles went down 4th of September, and they have this first get-together with George Martin, with Ringo in the group. And they run through some of the songs, they do How Do You Do It, and you could tell their heart wasn't in it. And they really wanted to just do their own songs, which was quite bold of them and quite ballsy, but you know, the four lads from Liverpool and that they were good with their mouths, particularly John. So they stuck to that, and they did, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 or something takes of Love Me Do, and Ringo couldn't get it. So they made their acetates at the end of the night. Off they come back to Liverpool and go around and do a few more gigs. George Martin listens to the acetate and thinks, yeah, the drumming's not right. I'm going to stick to what I said originally. I'm still going to use a session drummer.
So even though George Martin had said to Brian Epstein some time ago I was going to use a session drummer, that first session on the 4th of September, Andy White was not there.
No, he wasn't, which to me says that was almost like running through a recording test. At that point, George Martin didn't even know which songs they were definitely going to release as a single. So it was a recording session under recording conditions, but he wasn't expecting a record to come from it. And he was still in two minds at the end of it, what it was like. So he listened back to those and thought, okay, we'll go with Love Me Do, but I'm still going to use a session drummer because Ringo isn't doing what I want him to do. So when I spoke to Andy, he says he got the phone call a couple of days, so around the 6th or 7th of September, and it's all done via a fixer. It's just like an agent rings up and said, right, you've got a job at such and such. So be at Abbey Road on the 11th of September in the morning, whatever, and you're making a record. You don't know who the group is, you don't know the songs. So on the 11th of September, Andy White walks in and sets up his drum kit. The interesting reaction is what happens next. In walks John, Paul, George and Ringo. Ringo sees somebody else setting up a drum kit and says, hang on, what's going on here? Nobody had told him that they were going to be using a session drummer.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though John, Paul and George knew, nobody said anything to him. So Ringo was shocked, and he's sent off to the control booth to sit there. And his words are, I thought they were doing a Pete Best on me.
Right. Yeah.
So Andy White then works with John, Paul and George. They do some run-throughs, and this is what you get from a session drummer. They sort out Love Me Do, to do P.S. I Love You, and even an early run-through of Please Please Me. In the session, he gets his £5 or whatever it was, and off he pops to another session. And that was the basis of getting the first single out. Now what happens next? Again, we're not completely sure why, but when he goes to the anthology, Ringo says, I was gutted because I never played on our first single. But he did. Because the first single when it came out as Love Me Do is Ringo's version. The album version is Andy White's. Any future releases are Andy White's, and in fact the master of Ringo's version was destroyed in 1963, which says to me Ringo's version was released by mistake, because Andy White's, it is slightly better, and again I've had somebody analyse the differences, and it's a little bit brighter, a little bit faster, and a bit more regular. So again, we've got drummers to analyse the difference in the two versions. Ironically, the Andy White version is better because of the tambourine, which is played by Ringo. So actually, Andy White, it's a nice regular, and it's exactly what you want from a studio drummer. But Ringo's use of percussion, which becomes ever more important as the Beatles' recording career goes on, that tambourine helps to liven the track up. Personally, I think it's a dull song. I've never been a fan of Love Me Do. I don't think it's that good a song. And it got him into the charts, and it starts the career. But that's what Andy White was there to do. Do that session, make some recordings, and off you pop.
Fascinating, Dave. So today, Dave, we found out that Pete Best wasn't sacked from the group. We found out that probably, almost certainly, the reason that they thought they needed to remove him was a misunderstanding between what George Martin said to Brian Epstein and how he heard that about using a session drummer. And also, we found out that Ringo potentially could have alleviated the need for a session drummer had George Martin on that 4th of September recording heard him and thought, well, I don't need a session drummer anymore. Yep. That could have stopped him making the call, or one of his people making the call to Andy White's fixer to bring him in for the 11th. And also, you know, with the Beatles detective head on of Dave Bedford, you're fairly sure that the single version, which featured Ringo, was released in error.
I think so. I think that's what the evidence points to, because if they use Andy White's version on the album and any future releases, whether here or in the US, Andy White's version was perceived to be the better version, and so they destroyed the master of Ringo's one. The funny little twist in this, and whether this was done deliberately or not, when it came to the 50th anniversary of the release of Love Me Do, they decided to re-release it as a single, and they put the wrong version out, and they had to recall them and put the correct version out again. so whether that was an error or someone was just having an inside joke, who knows?
Who knows?
But so that's partway through the 23 drummers, because Ringo wasn't the 23rd. He wasn't the last. There's about another, I think it's 8 or 9 drummers after Ringo joins in August '62 who crop up in the book.
That is amazing, Dave. That is amazing. And if we had time, we would go through who those 8 and 9 drummers are. But the easiest way to do that is get a copy of the book. How can people get hold of the book, Dave?
The easiest way is to go onto our website, www.thefourthbeatle, beatlesbanter.com. Now there's a limited edition hardback, and we've only done 1,000, and even before it came out last summer, we'd sold over 300 of those. So if you want the limited edition version, they're going fast. With that, obviously they're signed, and including that is a double CD. There's over 40 tracks, and that's got as many of the drummers featured in the book who played on a record, including one that we haven't mentioned who appeared in the spring of 1961 when the lineup was John, Paul, George and Alan.
That's interesting.
So he's on there. Plus we've got the whole of the Decca audition, the first BBC radio performances with Pete, the EMI audition and the EMI sessions in September as well. Because I wanted to think, well, okay, we've given, like I said, the analysis by drummers. That's all in the book. Then go and listen to it on the CD and see if you agree with our drummers or not. You may or may not. We want to give you every opportunity to listen to the experts' advice. So, did we find the right fourth Beatle? I think they got it right.
You've been listening to Liddypod, Beatles Banter with Bedford and Beesley.